Hello everyone, this is Mr. Millette with an AP World History presentation. Today's presentation is all about the maintenance of empires in the early modern period of world history. In our last presentation, we looked at how some early modern land-based empires were built and expanded throughout their local regions. Today, we will focus on how those regional land-based empires were able to maintain effective control over their empires for elongated periods of time. In the last presentation, we specifically looked at the Qing Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Safavid Empire. We also looked a bit at the Songhai Empire and the Russian Empire. Today, we revisit those land-based empires and see the methods and techniques they employed to keep their empire intact throughout the early modern period, 1450 to 1750. By the end of this presentation, you will be expected to be able to demonstrate your understanding of this learning objective. Explain how rulers used a variety of methods to legitimize and consolidate their power in land-based empires from 1450 to 1750. Studying the establishment or building of empires throughout pre-modern and modern world history, one gets a sense of glorification for the powerful men whose valiant and courageous wars of expansion successfully brought population and territory under their sword. If we look to the examples of the likes of Alexander the Great in the Hellenistic Empire, or Qin Shi Huangdi in the unification of the First Chinese Empire under the Qin dynasty, or Genghis Khan in the Mongolian Empire, we all recognize the difficult accomplishments of these militarily superior individuals. As great and impactful that their accomplishments may very well have been in shaping the world as we know it, they merely laid a foundation for the next several centuries of their people's history. And in some cases, those foundations were not so solid or built for longevity, as history would prove. For example, Alexander's empire divided into 3 Hellenistic kingdoms after his premature death, and it would be his successors that determined how to make those kingdoms stabilize and prosper. Likewise, Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi's Qin dynasty lasted approximately 20 years, which is not very long for a Chinese dynasty's reign compared to others throughout Chinese history. In a brutal and swift fashion, Qin Shi Huangdi established order in China, but it was the leaders that followed him that utilized methods that were necessary to keep order in China. After Genghis Khan's death, his vast Mongolian empire divided into 4 smaller kingdoms, and it was left to his sons and grandsons and their descendants as to how to maintain those kingdoms' longevity. In the early modern period of world history, great empire builders had to be followed by great empire maintainers in order for empires to stabilize and prosper over time. In this segment, we are going to analyze the maintenance phase of empire by focusing on the methods utilized by those in power over the generations of early modern empires. For simplicity, I analyzed the maintenance phase of empire into 3 basic components. One of those components is the empire's necessity to keep political order over time. This goes beyond merely establishing a single state that has a centralized location, or merely establishing peace to once politically divided and contentious regions of the world. Rather, to keep political order is to employ methods and techniques that preserve order, protect an empire's sovereignty, and may preempt or subdue political threats and challenges. In the classical period, the Roman imperial government financed the construction of roads and other pieces of infrastructure, so they could move their legions throughout the empire and secure their populations from external and internal threats. Likewise, the Han dynasty established an effective bureaucracy of formally educated Confucian scholars who served in positions of authority so as to carry out the decrees and functions of the Han emperor. The Persians developed a courier network known as the Royal Road so as to swiftly dispatch military orders, so that the Persian king's military could be most efficient in its mobility and reinforcements. In the early modern period, political elites would also employ methods and administrative techniques to keep political order in their empires. A second component of empire maintenance is the empire's necessity to keep social order over time. This goes beyond the merely putting fear into civilian populations when they heard the reverberant galloping of a massive cavalry approaching. Rather, it involves what a government does after the conquests are complete and a period of governance begins. The transition from conqueror to governor is a transition that many world leaders throughout history have failed to actualize. To distinguish, conquerors use force in an attempt to take territory, whereas governors use methodology and technique in an attempt to keep social order. The Babylonian empires in ancient times was built by conquest, but its social order was, in part, kept by the use of a law of retribution, known as Hammurabi's Code of Law. In the Chinese dynasties of the pre-modern period, the Confucian leadership did not stray too far away from the legalist techniques of rewards and punishments, and oftentimes employed legalist methods when necessary. Additionally, the ideology of Confucianism promoted moral and behavioral expectations, such as Ren, or humanity and generosity, Li, or propriety and righteousness, and Zhao, or filial piety, the reverence and respect for family members' roles, and respect for elders within a family. Likewise, Indian empires employed Hindu ethics and the caste system in order to achieve a level of societal behavior that was conducive to the preservation of social order. In many cases, political elites employed religious teachings and practices in order to keep social order, and sometimes those political elites would employ varied levels of religious tolerance and intolerance to maintain their empires. During the early modern period, political elites employed an array of methods and techniques to keep social order. The third component of the maintenance phase of empire is the empire's necessity to prosper economically. During the building phase of empire, conquerors go to great lengths to take desired territory in order to achieve an environmental mosaic. However, economic prosperity is achieved when political elites who are governing a resource-rich territory have utilized methods and techniques that capitalize on their empire's exploits. A conqueror's army may have marched victoriously into arable and fertile lands and brought it under its empire's rule, but a governor has employed methods and techniques to consistently extract the economic benefits from the land and populations they govern. For example, the Romans did more than merely move their legions and navies into the lands and populations of Carthage, Macedonia, and Egypt. The Romans employed an elaborate system of commercial farming and slavery in order to maximize food production of recently conquered territories. Both the Romans and the Han Chinese financed great irrigation works, like the construction of aqueducts, canals, and dams, as well as other pieces of infrastructure in order to maximize the accessibility of water in both rural and urban parts of their empires. The Mongols did not just pompously gallop the trails of Central Asia, but rather they organized and protected the Silk Road. And for that protection, they extracted a tribute of valuables from those who utilized the Silk Road. The Umayyad Caliphate did not just continue to make war against non-Muslim societies, but rather they governed non-Muslim societies and extended a level of tolerance by allowing them to keep their religious practices, so long as they agreed to pay the jizya tax. Revenue from the jizya tax was what financed the marvelous capital city of Damascus and its Arab political elite. During the early modern period, political elites utilized methods and techniques to continuously and consistently prosper economically from their exploits. One popular method that early modern empires utilized in order to keep political order in their land-based empires was the rendering of bureaucratic elites and military professionals. Attach an epithet of great or magnificent to an emperor's name and realize that that epithet was earned from the competence and success of the bureaucrats and military professionals that served them. Loyalty, competence, effectiveness, organization, and discipline of bureaucratic elites and military professionals were all characteristics that helped carry out the function of an imperial government and reinforce that government's centrality. During the early modern period, the Ottoman Empire utilized an elite military known as the Janissary Corps. The Janissaries were known for their loyalty, as many of the Janissaries were derived through a tributary system known as the Devshirme. Whereas most tributary systems extracted tribute in the form of money or produced crops and goods, sometimes tribute was taken in other forms when money or produced goods were not available. Sometimes all an individual had to offer in terms of tribute to the empire was their labor or their military service. The Ottomans worked this system of tribute to build its Janissary Corps. In fact, during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent and his successful conquests of southeastern Europe's Christian societies, most of the boys taken as tribute through the Devshirme were Christian boys. The Christian boys would be brought to Istanbul and would be converted to Islam, trained as soldiers, oftentimes educated in the liberal arts and sciences, and forged a personal relationship with the Sultan. The Devshirme helped to build military effectiveness, political competency, and imperial loyalty, so therefore the Janissary Corps could help to preserve the political order of the Ottoman sultans. Another example of an early modern professional military was the samurai, whose role in Japanese society predated the early modern period. The samurai were known for their loyalty, bushido, their military superiority, and the wielding of their katana. Prior to 1600, the Sengoku period had experienced severe political disunity and civil war. The samurai were loyal to their daimyo, which were Japanese feudal lords. Until the Japanese state and daimyo clan of Tokugawa defeated the other clans and brought unity to Japan, the samurai were occupied with warfare within Japan against fellow samurai. After Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan as the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, which reigned from 1600 to 1867, the samurai's loyalty shifted a bit. Tokugawa shoguns employed a political method known as the bakufu, or tent government. Centralized at the city of Edo, known as Tokyo today, the shoguns required the daimyo leaders to report to the court at Edo to attend a full year of inculcation in loyalty and responsibility to the shogun. In essence, the daimyo who retained their samurai were expected to remain loyal to the shogun. Henceforth, the samurai were equipped to protect the 4 major Japanese islands from a foreign threat rather than do battle amidst each other. A third example were the Cossacks, who served a similar role to the protection and preservation of political order within the Russian Empire throughout the early modern period. Initially, the Cossacks were used to gather the Russian lands in the establishment of the first recognized Russian state of Muscovy. Eventually, the Cossacks came to play a role of militarily protecting the Russian landholds in Siberia and in the borderlands with the Qing dynasty of China. The Cossacks were a rugged and feared group of military professionals that enabled the Russian czars from Moscow and St. Petersburg to extend their centralized imperial reach across the Ural Mountains. And they were a big reason for the near 3.5 centuries of Russian imperial maintenance. A final example would be China's Qing dynasty's use of bureaucratic elites known as the Confucian scholar bureaucrats. These scholar bureaucrats, sometimes referred to as the scholar gentry, due to the fact that most of them came from the Chinese nobility, were formally educated in Confucianism and ultimately prepared for a position as a government official. Put through years of formal education and difficult academic examinations, a scholar bureaucrat would be placed into a governmental position in which he was expected to faithfully and loyally carry out the decrees of the dynastic emperor. What Confucius would have referred to as the Junzi in Chinese society, these scholar bureaucrats were expected to demonstrate the values of Ren, Li, and Zhao, and serve as role models to the rest of the Chinese citizenry. The Qing's scholar bureaucrats helped to reinforce the political centrality of the dynasty, which helped to keep the dynasty's political order in China. Another method that early modern political elites employed to keep political and social order was the promotion of belief systems, such as religions or ideologies. This was not uncommon in pre-modern world history either, but into the early modern period, this method further legitimized the rule of political elites, as sponsoring a particular religion or ideology led to more unity within an empire, promoted the superiority of its believers, and extended privileges to its believers. The best examples of empires who sponsored a religion that legitimized the leader's rule and extended protections and privileges to worshippers were the Islamic-based empires of the early modern period. In West Africa, the Songhai Empire. In the Middle East, Southeast Europe, and North Africa, the Ottoman Empire. In Central Asia, the Safavid Empire, and in South Asia, the Mughal Empire, all sponsored Islam as their state-sponsored faith. For Muslims in the Ottoman and Songhai empires, they were protected from being enslaved. Additionally, under the reign of most of the Mughal emperors, Islam was promoted, and other religious groups, namely Hindus, but Buddhists and Jains included, had to pay the jizya tax to the Mughal emperors. The Safavids promoted a form of Shia Islam known as Twelver Shiism, and went to great lengths to convert the peoples of Central Asia to Twelver Shiism. In the Qing dynasty in China, the emperors promoted Confucianism as the state ideology. In their decrees and in their scholar bureaucracy, they expected subjects to abide by the ethics of Ren, Li, and Zhao. In terms of filial piety, elders within a family were to be revered and cared for by youth. Filial piety also reinforced the patriarchal traditions of Chinese society. In fact, arranged marriages, widow chastity, and foot binding were all practices that were continued throughout the Qing dynasty's reign. Chaste arches were built in family cemeteries to honor and memorialize deceased Chinese women who had remained unwed and chaste for the remainder of their lives after their husbands had passed away. All of these Confucian-based practices were not just expected of the subjects, but were publicly practiced by the emperors themselves. Qing emperors would lead professionals from the Forbidden City, the Imperial Palace in Beijing, to the Temple of Agriculture. And adorned in peasant clothing, the emperor would begin tilling the land during the spring equinox. This was to ensure a bountiful harvest in China, and it worked to unify the peasantry in their duties to be productive and industrious. And the ritual also signified the beginning of the growing season. Also, in terms of filial piety, Kongzhi, the Qing emperor from 1661 to 1722, reigned for exactly 61 years. His grandson, Qianlong, who reigned from 1736 to 1797, also exactly 61 years, resigned his throne in his 61st year so as to respect his grandfather's long reign. Emperor Qianlong also oversaw the publication of the Siku Quanchu, or the Emperor's Four Treasuries, which was a collection of Chinese and Confucian texts that were made available at special libraries built for the purpose of preserving and publicizing the writings. In Europe, the monarchs, in order to instill their political and religious legitimacy, utilized the notion of divine right. The notion of divine right proclaimed that a monarch had a God-given right to rule with absolute authority and no restrictions. Prominent religious institutions, such as the Roman Catholic Church, also supported divine right. In nations like France and Spain, the divine right and the Catholic Church's support of the divine right legitimized the absolute rule of their monarchs. During the 16th century, Spanish monarch Philip II, who was known as the Defender of the Faith, was considered to be divinely ordained to rule over Spanish Christendom. It was his duty to see to it that Catholicism was the only religious practice in the entire Spanish dominion. Likewise, throughout the second half of the 17th century and the early part of the 18th century, in France, Louis XIV, the Sun King, was an absolute monarch whose legitimacy was grounded in the divine right. Backed by the Catholic Church and its leadership, Louis went to great lengths to stamp out religious minorities and challenges in order to promote Catholicism as the only true and righteous religion in all of the French dominion. Even in the Russian Empire, the Romanov czars were considered to have divine right to rule. From the time of Peter the Great and the creation of the Holy Synod in the Russian Orthodox Church, Orthodox Christianity came under greater control of the Russian czars. Although some czars such as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great were not personally devout in their religious beliefs, most czars recognized the necessity of the divine right to legitimize their rule. During the early modern period, not all emperors were forceful in their promotion of religion. In fact, some political leaders took different measures to combat religious intolerance, discrimination, and conflict by employing methods of religious toleration and coexistence. The best examples of the use of religious toleration were in England and India during the late 16th century. In England, religious division, tension, and conflict had characterized the first half of the 16th century. From King Henry VIII's English Reformation and the establishment of an independent Church of England that recognized Henry as the supreme leader of Anglican Christianity, as opposed to the Pope, through the conflicts between Anglicans and Catholics in England, the nation was clearly one of religious division. Henry utilized persecution to rid his nation of disloyal Catholics who refused to recognize his supremacy. After Henry's death, the pendulum swung the other direction when his daughter Queen Mary took the throne. A devout Catholic, Queen Mary persecuted Anglicans who failed to recognize the supremacy of the Roman Catholic Church. Finally, when Elizabeth, Henry's youngest daughter, took the throne, a compromise known as the Elizabethan Settlement was made between Catholics and Protestants. Elizabeth enacted policies that led to the protections of both religious groups, and she worked hard to quell the tensions between them. Like Elizabeth in England, Akbar in Mughal, India, also dealt with religious division, tension, and conflict. In India, the majority religion was Hinduism. However, the Mughal dynasty, Akbar included, were devout Sunni Muslims. Most of the Mughal emperors used their political and religious authorities to promote Islam as the superior religion in India, in spite of pushbacks by Hindus. Akbar was different, as he took measures to compromise between the two religious groups in an effort to minimize the tensions and conflicts. First, Akbar removed the jizya tax, which appealed to the large Hindu population. Second, Akbar promoted something known as the divine faith in order to promote himself as a divinely ordained individual that all peoples, Hindus and Muslims alike, could venerate as a way of bridging the differences between the two religious groups. Another technique that political elites utilized during the early modern period in order to keep political and social order was the financing of monumental architecture and elaborate works of art. In ancient world history, Mesopotamian ziggurats, Egyptian pyramids, Olmec colossal heads, Mayan pyramids and temples, and Greek and Roman temples were all forms of monumental architecture that showed off the wealth, dominance, and superiority of the political elites. Additionally, these types of artworks demonstrated by creativity, engineering, and cosmic design helped to promote greater political centrality and legitimize the rule of the political elites. One of the best examples of pre-modern architecture of this magnitude and utility was the Hagia Sophia, built in Constantinople during the long and prosperous reign of Byzantine Emperor Justinian. Justinian had this magnificent church adorned with precious stones and metals and elaborate marble work. Justinian declared the Hagia Sophia as a gift to the people of Constantinople. And as much as it was an aesthetic gift, it also demonstrated his wealth and power. Early modern political elites practiced similar methods of expressing their power, wealth, and prestige in an attempt to legitimize their rule. Imperial palaces were especially utilized to demonstrate the wealth, power, and prestige of the political elites. Additionally, imperial palaces helped to maintain political centrality over long periods of time. One example of an impressive imperial palace was the Palace of Versailles in France. Once a Bourbon dynasty hunting lodge, King Louis XIV ordered additional construction after 1651 to convert the lodge into an imperial palace. During the period of French Baroque art and architecture, the Palace of Versailles would be adorned with numerous marble terraces and plazas, fountains and royal apartments, and more than 700 rooms. The most elaborate of the features was the Hall of Mirrors, adorned with more than 300 mirrors on the walls and in the archways of the hall. This lavish palace became the central command of Louis XIV's absolutism, and it would remain as such until the French Revolution in 1789. In Russia, imperial palaces also helped to display the wealth, power, and prestige of the political elites. In Moscow, the Kremlin, which was reconstructed in the 15th century during the reign of Muscovite Prince Ivan the Great, served as the imperial palace of the Russian Empire until the middle of the 18th century. Another Russian imperial palace that furthered political centrality and demonstrated wealth, power, and prestige of the political elites was the Winter Palace. Built in the early 18th century and begun in the late reign of Peter the Great, the Winter Palace was designed as a lavish, Baroque imperial palace in a newly constructed Western-influenced city known as St. Petersburg, near the Baltic Sea in western Russia. As Peter's windowed to the west, St. Petersburg's Winter Palace became the headquarters for the Romanov dynasty until its overthrow in 1917. Similarly, the Forbidden City, constructed during the early 15th century and the reign of the Ming dynasty in Beijing, served as the elaborate headquarters of the Ming and Qing dynasties until the end of the dynastic period in China in 1911. Similarly, Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, Turkey, served as command central for the Ottoman sultans from 1478 until 1583. Mehmed II, the sultan who conquered the Byzantine city of Constantinople and renamed the city to Istanbul, ordered the construction of Topkapi Palace overlooking the Golden Horn in the Bosporus. Religious architecture was also constructed by political and religious elites in order to demonstrate wealth, power, and prestige within early modern empires. The gunpowder empires engineered the most impressive mosques of the early modern period. Adorned with domes, minarets, and archways, the multi-storied mosques of the Islamic empires were built taller and larger than any other non-Islamic temples within their respective empires. Imperial decree ensured that Jewish synagogues and Christian churches could not be taller than the mosques of the gunpowder empires. In the Ottoman Empire, the Süleymaniye, located in Istanbul, was constructed during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent and demonstrated his wealthy and powerful long reign in the 16th century. Likewise, the Royal Mosque in Isfahan, Iran, ordered by Shah Abbas I, was adorned with minarets, domes, and archways. The Royal Mosque employed more Persian architectural style, as it was built during the 17th century at the height of the Safavid Empires' reign. However, the most recognizable Islamic structure in the world may quite possibly be the mosque and mausoleum, the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal, located in Agra, India, was ordered by Shah Jahan in the 17th century to be the burial place of his deceased wife. The Taj is adorned with multiple minarets, domes, and archways, and is eclipsed by an amazing reflection pool. Built at the height of the Mughal Empire in India, this Islamic structure stands out in a modern India that is predominantly Hindu. The best example of an early modern European piece of religious architecture would be St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican in Rome, Italy. Began during the Italian Renaissance, the basilica is the resting place of St. Peter and is the most impressive structure in the entirety of Vatican City. It is the church over which the Pope presides, and it is in close proximity to the apostolic palace that the Pope resides in. Early modern empires were expensive and high maintenance, and unless political elites could get a return on their exploits, then empires would have dwindled. The early modern period may have been the last time period in which the regional land-based empires truly thrived and prospered. In an age of emergent transoceanic maritime empires, the land-based empire was essentially coming of age. In spite of the lucrative transoceanic empire building that was happening simultaneously, land-based empires extracted exorbitant amounts of tax and tribute from their subjects. One thing was for sure: in order for an empire to benefit economically, the empire had to remain productive. The land-based empires employed effective methods of tax and tribute collecting so as to maintain the existence of their vast empires. Tax collection came in several forms, but the most common form was the levying of a tax on the subjects' produced goods and crops. In the Mughal Empire, the political elites entrusted the zamindars, who were landowning Indians who had the ability to collect tax from the laboring Vishya and Shudra castes, or cultivators and peasants, who dwelled in the lands of the zamindars. A portion of the taxes raised by the zamindars was funneled to the Mughal emperors, but oftentimes the zamindars were extended titles and privileges that enabled them to manage their lands as semi-autonomous principalities. In addition to the devshirme, or blood tax of Christian boys, the Ottomans also practiced a system of tax farming. Tax farming was done by local tax collectors who were entrusted by the Ottoman sultans to develop their own collection methods in rural and urban regions of the empire. Typically, the tax collectors would collect produced goods and crops. Those local tax collectors were allowed to keep a small percentage of the tax received, but were expected to funnel the rest back to the sultans in Istanbul. Prior to Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire utilized a prosperous tributary system to collect staples and luxury goods from neighboring peoples. Also, the Ming dynasty in China changed their currency and taxation practices from tax farming to a silver currency standard. As the global age emerged, the global flow of silver moved large quantities from the Spanish-controlled mines in the Americas into the Afro-Eurasian societies in the Eastern Hemisphere. As the Spanish sought to establish direct commercial access with China, silver was their key to the Chinese ports. Late in the 16th century, the Ming dynasty stockpiled an enormous amount of silver by receiving so much from the Spanish and by imposing the silver standard on their subjects' tax payments. Without these methods of tax and tribute collection, the infrastructure, political and military professionals, and the monumental architecture of these empires could not have been financed, and empire would have fallen by the wayside in the early modern period.